Good evening, thanks Stevie. Before I begin, I'd obviously like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, past and present. But I also want to pay my respects to every single person who has spent time in J Ward and the Arradale Hospital and every other institution across this state and indeed across this country. If there is one thing I learned since working in mental health is that each and every one of us has our own story to tell. And often when those stories are told, we can then understand who people are and what they are as individuals. Firstly, thank you for inviting me to celebrate the 150th anniversary and to launch your exhibition, Hidden Lives. And in going around here, I snuck in early and had a look and read, and it really brought home what an honour it is to be invited here tonight. In preparing for tonight, I did a little bit of reading about J Ward, and as many you would know, it started off as a prison in 1859 during the gold rush era and later became an asylum for people with mental illness who had committed serious crimes. In some ways, looking at the photos of J Ward reminded me of a trip I once did to Port Arthur. And I don't know if those of you who've been around J Ward get the same feeling that you get when you walk around Port Arthur, is that you can reach out and feel the spirits of the people who have been here. Certainly when I looked at the photo of Bill Wallace, a patient of J Ward for some 64 years, you could see the torture in his eyes. And one hopes that all the people who spent time in J Ward and all the people who spent time in the institutions who've gone are now at peace, because they certainly deserve it. I first started working in mental health, as Debbie indicated, in 1989. In those days, let me tell you, I find it hard to believe, I had no grey hair, no wrinkles, no cellulite, women will appreciate using tweezers and all of those things. None of that started until I started working in mental health, I tell you. And I often say to people that working in mental health is not the most mentally healthy thing you can do. Despite the fact that it's extremely rewarding, it is one of the most stressful occupations I've ever had, and I think it would be fair comment to say that for every advocate. My introduction to mental health came as a result of a secondment into the Department of Human Services as the Patients Issues Officer, working out of the Office of Chief Psychiatrist. And it was a political decision because there'd been a lot of publicity about people with an intellectual disability. And so it was decided, and I'm not saying that it was the right thing, but it was decided that mental health needed to get some publicity as well. There was a competition going on, to be quite frank, between the secretaries of the Department of Human Services and the Department of Community Services. And I was the only non-psych trained clinician on the team of 5. There was a psychiatrist, 2 psych nurses, a psychologist and myself. And to say that this encounter changed my life would be an absolute understatement. I mean, I love nursing. Nursing, to me, is one of the finest professions that you can work in. You get to do for people what only their mum and dad have ever done for them before, and it's a real privilege. But as a result of that 2-year experience, I gave up nursing and have been advocating for people with mental illness ever since. The order took over 12 months, and during that time I saw and heard things that conjured up extreme emotions, including being absolutely enraged, extremely distressed, tearful. It was not uncommon for me to go home to my motel room at night and just bawl my eyes out. I could not believe, I was very confused about the dreadful state of our psychiatric institutions, what was going on in them, and how respective governments could have been so neglectful of such a most disadvantaged people in our community. At other times, I could be full of pride, admiration and respect for the skills and commitment I saw in the psychiatric workforce. But I have to say, some of my most cherished moments were with the patients. On the whole, once they knew I was not psychiatrically trained, which meant I was safe, because I couldn't diagnose anybody who saved a life, they were very protective of me. For example, one day I was in a ward interviewing patients, and I would spend several hours in each ward trying to get as much information from people as I could. The next day I was in another ward interviewing people, and I'd been in there for about 3 or 4 hours, and I came out and there was a man standing there that I'd interviewed the previous day. And he said to me, "I saw you go in," and he said, "I thought I should wait for you to come out because so-and-so was in the grounds and he's known to be violent and you're not so trained, so I want to escort you to where you need to go because I want to make sure that you're safe." And that was my experience with people. And certainly when I talked to the rest of the team, they confirmed that guy had been dangerous. And the interesting thing about that, which is not in here, was when I had actually interviewed that guy the previous day, and the nurses took me right down the end of the ward into a very small room on my own, out of sight of everyone. But I have to tell you that this dangerous man was an absolute thorough gentleman in the hour that I spent with him. The other thing I learned was that being a smoker was an absolute advantage, and it still is today. I started smoking holiday 50s because I needed to make sure that I actually had enough cigarettes to go around. And sometimes while I'd be sitting in the garden, my packet of 50 cigarettes would go missing. But throughout the day, somebody would come up and offer me a holiday cigarette, and I'd look at them and they'd have the most beautiful grins on their faces. I still smoke today because I believe it's my duty. I actually gave up for about 3 months. And people would come in and say, "Have you got a cigarette?" And I'd say, "I've given up." And the look on their faces, it was, I felt it was my duty to go back and start smoking again. In regard to Ararat, one of the things that bothered me about Ararat was the report that patients provided to me about the sexual activity occurring for money and cigarettes. For some women it was very distressing, as they felt they had gotten themselves into situations they just simply didn't know how to get themselves out of. And for others it wasn't an issue, as they said to me, "I've never got enough cigarettes." And that put me in that bind of what do you do about those sorts of things that's going on. And I can remember I made 3 recommendations. That the staff all had to undergo compulsory education about human sexuality, because at the time the patients were being controlled by the particular value system of the individuals who worked within the thing, and I didn't think that was right. The other thing I thought was that the patients needed to go about undertaking education as well about safe sex and relationships and things like that. Everybody was accepting of those recommendations, but the one final recommendation I made sent everybody into a spin. I suggested that there a room needed to be put aside on each wall that allowed people to express their sexuality, because I regarded the people in those institutions as normal, like everybody else, and had normal needs. Well, everybody went hysterical, but I stuck with it, and I said my only concern was that the queue would be a mile long and people would be banging on the door and they'd stand there, so I reckon get out of there, it's my turn. Luckily, we didn't have to stand firm because the places did get closed down. As I said in the beginning, working in mental health has crystallised my view that everyone has their own story to tell, and when you hear their story, it will often lead you to a better understanding of the person. For example, when I was working in the department, letters would often come in from Gary David, and you'll see his photo around, and he's otherwise known as Gary Ware. And it would send people into absolute rages, and because I hadn't met him or had any experience, they would give me his letters to look at to see whether his requests were reasonable or not. Then I met him, and I have to say he's the only person I've ever met where the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I was looking at somebody who, to me, didn't seem to have a conscience. But I have to say, when I heard about him and heard about how he was raised and the incredible torture that he experienced as a child, it left you no doubt why he turned out the way he did. He experienced things that no person, let alone a child, should experience. I guess in working with people like that, you have to admire the people who also work with them. It does take great skill and understanding. While I only visited the forensic inpatient unit at Ararat on one occasion, I do spend a lot of time, and did, at Long Park, and currently advocate for people in the Thomas Embley Hospital, which is the forensic hospital. And I have to say, my experience, while the Herald Sun in particular will emblazon headlines of most dangerous man in society and things like that, I've always felt completely safe. They are wonderful people. Had they been able to get the service when their parents or they were asking for, rather than being turned away, tragedies could have been prevented. And when they find out about these tragedies, they are in a dreadful state of grief. And I don't want to undervalue the incredible grief that families go through when they lose somebody from that point of view. But let me assure you, those people who are locked up also go through incredible grief. And just to give you an example of how it occurs, I once advocated, after the person had died, he was a young man, he was in the country, he grew up in that town, his best friend he went to kindergarten with, and they went away on a camping trip. And he had the diagnosis of schizophrenia. He became unwell on the camping trip. His friend took him to a hospital in New South Wales. They only kept him for 24 hours, and that's despite what was in the medical files. Clearly, this man was very unwell, but he was out of area, and they weren't going to pay for his services. And so they expected this very unwell man and his friend to drive 1,500 kilometres back to his country town. The absolute tragedy was that they didn't even make it back to the campsite. He killed his mate on the way back. He was taken to Long Bay Jail in Sydney. And of course, when he got his medication and kicked in about what he had done, he would be found rocking backwards and forwards saying, "Please, please kill me." He had a hearing and sight deficit, and for some unknown reason, wouldn't have been able to find out, they took away his hearing aid, they took away his glasses, and he hung himself because he was left in a cell on his own. That's the stuff that the community, I think, needs to hear about. It could have all been prevented. They could still be mates had services been available and responsive when people need them. Finally, I guess that I know in closing Ararat, it caused a lot of grief in the community because it was a significant source of employment. I also know that there was a significant amount of criticism about mental health services at the time, and it must have been very distressing for those who were working in the system at the time because there was so much criticism. As someone who was seeing the mental health system for the first time, I was shocked and horrified. But having said that, I have to say that the majority of people that I met who were working in the mental health system were good people. I spent a lot of time afterwards, at the end of my 2 years at Convent, trying to work out how on earth does this sort of thing happen. And these are the conclusions I came to, and this is, if you don't remember anything I say tonight, I'd like you to remember this, that it's because it's in all of us, that we develop habits of practice. If we see something often enough, we cease to see it. If we do something often enough, we do it without thinking. If we think something often enough, we think it without question. We only ever pick on those in a less powerful position than ourselves, and we tend not to get involved when abuse or neglect is happening unless it's a loved one. For us to have a respectful and responsive community that embraces everybody, and I think the measure of a community is how well we take care of our vulnerable people, we have to always keep in mind our habits of practice. I guess on that, I don't want to end on a negative note, but as one of the advocates argued, I argued for the closure of all the 19 institutions because I believe that people with mental illness and other disabilities had the right to the same freedoms as the rest of us.
Yeah, that's right.
Having said that, I must admit that I was very naive at the time because it never entered my head that we would discharge many of those people to the streets. But having met many of those people living on the streets, when you say to them, would you prefer a bed and a roof over your head or what you've got, they never once have said they prefer to go back to the institutions. They want what they've got. I think we can do better. We should not condition people with a disability that they're only entitled to live on the street or they're only entitled to a room. They're entitled to a home. And certainly in mental health, we haven't got them homes as yet. Put simply, the reason why these things occur is if mental illness forms 20% of the population. It's the third highest illness in the country, but we only get 6% of the budget. People get neglected, staff get burned out, people suffer. So the fight goes on. Despite 20 years of reform, people who do have a mental illness are still complaining about the same things. I want to end on a negative note. We've come a long way, but we have got such a long way to go, and we need the help of every single member of the community to get there. I'd now like to launch Hidden Lives. I've been around and had a look at it. It's brought a whole pile of memories back for me, and as I was going around, I was thinking, oh my God, I hope I don't burst into tears with this. I'd like to say a special thank you to Snake, who I can't see him at the moment, but he took me outside and we had a cigarette together, which brought back some of the very positive memories that I experienced in that 12 months of going around interviewing people. So I'd now like to introduce Sue Smith. I think you've done a magic job. I think all of you people who contributed to it should walk really tall. I think it's great. I certainly think it should be on permanent display. Thank you.